10. The Fifth House. Our Doris is in a wheelchair for the duration. After the court case, she flung herself into arranging the house for the garden safari. As in, she told me what she wanted and I started spending a lot more time down the allotment. I did think about asking British Gas whether they could reroute some electric so that I could watch television, but there's not much doing on daytime television unless you fancy constant repeats of Heartbeat. Either way, I have to keep a close eye on Tabitha Melrose's petunias. She's emigrated to the Yemen but doesn't want to give up her patch because it's a beggar to get on the list with the council, and she's not sure her new relationship with Sven will work out anyway. Says as he has mother issues and she's gone there for the sex, not the familial bonds. Alf were that worried he started bringing me lunch down to the shed. I said to him, do you know, I think I should join the WI. I've heard that much of its inner workings. He handed me a thermos mug of tea and said to me, Edith's been spending that much time around your house, I keep checking the toothbrushes still in the pot. I'd noticed. I'd barely been up 5 minutes before Our Doris were hammering on the bathroom. She yelled at me, she said, "Hurry up, Harold, Edith'll be here in a minute and I don't want the first thing she smells to be your flatulence. I chose this life. I refuse to share it with those who wish to frequent our parlour." I shouted back, I said, "We couldn't afford a parlour, Our Doris. If you'd had better aspirations, we could have afforded a parlour." I had better aspirations, but you held the purse strings. We could have afforded a parlour, but who fancied the new mop? I couldn't see it, but if the look could burn through bathroom doors, I'm sure it was then. As I gargled my mouthwash, she said to me, she hissed, "The Speed Clean 3006 is specially imported from Switzerland to make it easier for housewives the world over. I refuse to hear a word said against it. For how much that cost, I'm surprised it doesn't come with a ready printed injunction." I ended up at the coffee bar. The barista must have noticed the bags under my eyes because she offered me a free extra shot and brought my panini to the table. I'd ordered bacon and brie because mozzarella chicken and rockets did not seem like the perfect accompaniment to the 8 o'clock news. She said to me, "Aren't you that granny's husband?" "Which granny?" And this is where she got excited, all raised eyebrows and breathy tones, as her pace sped up and she said to me, "The one who attacked Mrs. Dooley. Me and girls from Slimming Club thought it were great. She were always coming in talking about how she could lose weight quickly. 1 week she'd be a stone heavier than the next week, and she'd try and tell us it was because she hadn't been getting enough vigorous exercise. And now we all know why, don't we? Either way, me and Elspeth think it were bricks." I had to admit, she had me befuddled. I said to her, "Bricks?" She nodded at this and said, "In her pockets. Anyhow, I don't blame your missus for throwing the scales at her. I wanted to do it myself a few times, but it did throw them out of sync. They tried to tell me that I was 37 stone. I mean, do I look like I'm 37 stone? I doubt they'd let me in Sainsbury's if I did." And she walked away with a, "Eat your panini before it gets cold," and a wink. I've never known something as difficult to chew with dentures as a panini. I bit into it and thought my dentures were stuck, that Fixident hadn't planned for bread that thin and hard it could fling your teeth across the room faster than any slingshot. I imagine it's what they must call crisp on the continent. Then again, everything Italian is al dente, and that may as well be another word for uncooked. I considered calling the barista back, but didn't want to contend with any more musings on the extramarital endeavours of Janice Dooley of Little Street. She'd been all over the Gazette talking about how Our Doris had always had it in for her. In retaliation, Our Doris had sent him previously unseen photographs of Janice from the 1970s, when she got absolutely beggared over 3 bottles of Babysham and a few glasses of Mrs. Pickering's homemade elderflower wine. The photographs showed her in various drunken positions and states of undress. She managed to keep her eyes open for 2 of them. One of them was taken over the top of a stall in the ladies at the church hall, which had me thinking Our Doris would stop at nothing to get blackmail material. Since it's now publicly known that they can't stand each other, they haven't held back in their proclamations of hatred. When it all started, Our Doris might have sent a short note to the Gazette, talking about how Janice Dooley's dress might have been cut wrong for a children's birthday tea. The week before last, she sent one note stating it said, "Janice Dooley is nothing short of a harlot in dresses that do nothing for her varicose veins." That was it. No mention of how she could solve the problem. No intimation that she could improve. Just a statement of fact alongside screenshots of security footage showing the scales hitting her in the midriff. Her collapsed on the trestle table, and another as she struggled to get low-fat porridge oats out of her hair. A few of the Bulgebusters ladies should have tried the coffee bar. It had taken that long to chew through the panini, and the hard bacon, and brie like Play-Doh, that claggy it stuck my tongue to my gums until I could swill my Americano around my mouth. They'd lose that much weight because the mouths would be out of use for a week. I'm pretty sure I came out of that coffee bar with more blisters than I would have if I'd planted my mouth in a coal fire. I ended up wandering around town, not doing much. The florist, Mrs. Singh, stood outside watering her hanging baskets. When she caught sight of me, she beckoned me over with a twitch of her fingers and a yell. She said to me, "Mr. Copeland, get yourself over here this instant." I don't know what it is about the mothers of Partridge Mews that breeds Aridans, but we must have more deaf men than the rest of the Northwest, and I'm pretty confident it's all to do with the ululating of wives. I managed my best smile in any case, wandered across, and I said to her, "How do, Mrs. Singh?" Well, if that didn't summon the most horrendous of faces, I don't know what it did. Mrs. Singh's face came over all gargoyle, and she said, "Do you know what I'm wearing?" I took a moment to look. I'm not that good with noticing the details. I didn't notice about Dame Edna Everidge until I started to develop something of a crush, and Alf took it upon himself to break the news. Mrs. Singh wore a long, creamy-looking salwar kameez. With salwar that thin, they must have broken a dozen health and safety laws, and I said to her, "It's a salwar kameez, Mrs. Singh. I should know, you spent 3 months educating me about it in 1989. She nodded at this and said to me, "Exactly. And since then we've gone on to become great friends." I only came in for tomato seeds. It were the look you gave. That weren't at your clothing, it were the price. If I'd been buying beanstalk seeds, I might have agreed. Anyway, she said to me with a breath before continuing, "That young lad of Ingrid Merkelson's went past not 15 minutes ago, spouting forth about how disgusting and I should be out of my pyjamas by now. I mean, how disrespectful. Is he entirely ignorant? I should think it's more disgusting to wander about town with his trousers hung that low. I can almost see his buttocks chewing his underwear." I did something I wouldn't have done in usual circumstances, because I like to think that I can be quite kind to folk. But I said to Mrs. Singh, "I don't have time for this today, Jacinta. Either beat him about the head with a mop bucket or ring his mother, but I've got problems of my own." And that's when I went to the allotment, and stayed there. I couldn't be doing with people. If they're not asking me if I can grow a 300-year-old oak tree in 2 weeks to block out the unsightly mess that is my shed, then they're asking me about Our Doris. Ernest Outhwaite actually went so far as to ask whether I could put in a good word for him, and having moved up to 4th house from 7th. I mentioned it to Our Doris, and she didn't even say anything, just gave me the look and uffed as though the suggestion weren't worth her time. I stayed a few hours after Alf left and set off home. When I got there, Our Doris were in the lounge watching my recorded episodes of Groundforce. I said to her, "What's for dinner, Our Doris?" And she said to me, and it were a bolt out of the blue it was, she said, "I've ordered Chinese, it'll be here in about 20 minutes. Now get yourself in the kitchen and make a brew. I've been at this for 7 hours and I've yet to discover how to grow a clematis." I put the kettle on and looked out into the garden that had become something of my pride and joy in the last half a century. When we first moved in, it had been nothing more than paving slabs and a few weeds. Me and a few of the lads made it something of a project. I were the first of the lot to be married, and once Alf set his sights on Edith's Victoria sponge, he were more than ready to make her Mrs. Simpson. We dug out the garden and planted grass seeds, built the shed in the corner where it wouldn't detract from the view of the back kitchen, and Our Doris's old man gave me his copy of the Reader's Digest Gardening Year. Over time, the garden had become my contribution towards the house, seeing as Our Doris wouldn't set foot on the grass as she worried the chlorophyll might ruin her plimsolls, and she didn't want me using a hoover as I didn't know how to handle it in a manner befitting the husband of an upper-middle-class heterosexual white woman with a penchant for show tunes and P.D. James. When she first brought up the garden safari, I knew that I would end up doing the majority of the hard grafting. Our Doris got rid of the slugs, but she made sure that no amount of dirt ever touched her dungarees. I think she must have threatened it, made some sort of deal with the devil, that if he made sure her clothes stayed clean, he could have the soul of Janice Dooley of Little Street. At least I hope she chose Janice. Once the kettle boiled, I made the tea and went back into the lounge. Our Doris had switched over to Channel 3 and were watching the chase. That's when I noticed her clothes. She wore blue jeans. I said to her, "What's with the denim, Our Doris?" She shrugged and said to me, "I have a deep clean planned, Our Harold. The certain well-wishers who attend the garden safari will wish to come indoors, and I plan on offering them a delightfully delectable feast of multicultural cuisine and quiche Lorraine for the vegans." I said to her, "There's bacon in that, Our Doris." "Of course there's bacon. They eat nothing but runner beans for 365 days of the year. When they enter the fifth house, our home, after a long day of seeing subpar gardens, I want them to know that they needn't worry about any societal obligations. Being vegan's all down to peer pressure, Harold, and I'll have none of it in my house." I was saved by the doorbell and went to collect the Chinese. Our Doris had ordered me something reminiscent of fish chips and mushy peas. After the panini that morning and Alf sandwiches which were more like bricks, it was welcome. I said to Our Doris, "Thanks for this, Our Doris. Don't be getting any ideas about this, Harold. I'll be expecting you in that kitchen tomorrow evening. I'd quite like a salad, nothing too fancy, but a dressing would be nice, and new potatoes, and perhaps some chicken breasts and a mint vinaigrette." I chewed my fish and nodded, hoping my eyes hadn't betrayed me. Our Doris always has high expectations of my culinary skills. She shouldn't have worried about the cooking. Should have stuck to thinking about whether Modesty Duxbridge really deserved the award for services to the feline community after rescuing a cat from the refrigerator section of Lidl. Instead, Our Doris woke up with intentions to get straight on with her deep clean. I woke up to the sound of Our Doris's earth-shattering scream. It were worse than a banshee cry, worse than when you accidentally step on the foot of a dachshund. I staggered down the stairs to find her sprawled on the liner in the kitchen. The Speed Clean 3006 between her legs, that did not have enough elasticity to be in the position they were in. And she yelled at me. Lord, did she yell? She said, "Get that ambulance on the phone, Harold. Tell them as I've been the victim of foreign cleaning products. I'll write to my MP. Heads will roll, Harold. Switzerland won't know what's hit them." The ambulance were there within 10 minutes. If heads were going to roll, Our Doris wouldn't stop with the Swiss. I sat in the hospital waiting room whilst Our Doris heckled at doctors in one of the consultation rooms. I could hear her scream. She said, "Of course it's a 10. I've never dislocated my hip before in my life. Is there another numeral you were looking for? Did you wish to delegate my pain to a number 4 so that you could save on the morphine and increase your pay package? Because I won't stand for it, doctor. I have paid my taxes. I am due that morphine, and if I'm not on a drip within 3 minutes, I will write to the Partridge Mews Gazette, informing them of your refusal to treat, in an adequate manner, a 72-year-old woman who has lived in this town her entire life." She's had a bad opinion of the NHS ever since she went to the vending machine for a Coca-Cola and discovered they only had Dr. Pepper Zero, a beverage she says is a deterrent for the morbidly obese that need never be created had anyone over 11 stone had some self-control. I brought Our Doris a sandwich from the cafe across the road and went to see her in her cubicle. She was sat on the bed reading her notes, her glasses balanced on the tip of her nose like some magician with a spoon, and she said to me, without even looking up, she said, "You ought to go home and check on the garden. It took an awful lot of planning to achieve the fifth house, and I'm not prepared to throw it all away for a simple dislocated hip." I put the sandwich down. I was flabbergasted. I looked at her and I said to her, being too honest for my own good, I said, "This garden safari will be the death of you, Our Doris. In the last year, you've caused more friction within the family than in the last 50 years. You've lost a tooth. You stopped me seeing my friends. You attacked someone and were almost imprisoned. You've been sentenced to community service, and all because of this blasted garden safari. Look at Violet Grey. She had to leave town, and the way you're going, you'll soon be following her example." Our Doris closed the brown folder, all diplomatically, as though she were about to announce a war, and she said to me, emphasising the hate, she said, "Harold, in the last 50 years, I have been through a lot, and yet I have never lost my determination to better myself. I have never been one for horticulture, as well you know, yet I have always been accustomed to seeing a beautiful festoon of floristry displays in our back garden, all accomplished by you, my husband. Did it never occur to you that I wanted to share my husband's talents with the world?" I must admit I was floundering. I said to her, "You did this for me?" She gave me the look and said to me, she said, "Of course I did it for you. I've always known you were worth fifth house in the garden safari. You work harder than most of the so-called gardeners in town. You can tell a hyacinth from a hibiscus. There isn't that long until the garden safari, so please, go home and get to work. I took a final look at Our Doris, the world thundering in my head like a train through a tunnel, and I left. After I picked our Theo up from school, I took him home. I said to him, "Do you think I'm too harsh on your grandmother?" He switched on the television and said to me, he said, "What happened at the hospital?" I told him and he looked mildly stupefied before rising from his seat and heading towards the kitchen. "I'll make a brew," he said. I followed him and said, "You didn't answer my question." "Because there's no answer. You've been married to her for the majority of your life. You know one another more than anyone else. You can't expect your 14-year-old grandson to have an answer when he can't even figure out the value of X." He added an extra sugar to my brew before handing it over. "She told me that the garden safari is for me. That's no surprise. For years she's been Mrs. Doris Copeland and you've been her husband. She wanted to let you know she notices you. You seem to understand your grandmother more than I do. And on the outside it's easier to judge. Shall we have a look at the garden?" He opened the back door and looked out at the orchids and daffodils and assorted shrubberies. There were a light breeze and pollen in the air, and all I could think about was how Our Doris wasn't there to enjoy it. I said to our Theo, "I don't think there's anything we need to do, Theo. It's been good enough for fifth house for over half a century. It'll be all right now." The paramedics brought Our Doris home the next day, deposited her in the lounge and said no to the offer of a brew after a stern glare from the good wife herself. Once they'd gone, I said to her, "How are you feeling?" And she said, "We've got a lot to do, Arold." "I know," I said. Over the next fortnight, the WI spent more time at our house. We went through that many tea bags, shares in PG chips must have gone through the roof. Pandra O'Malley bought some hanging baskets from Mrs. Singh's that found their way to the front door as Our Doris thought that they might take away from the passionate nuances of our themed back garden. I said to her, "I never made any theme to the garden, Our Doris." The wheelchair gave her even more of a threat of menace as she said to me, "That's because there isn't one, Harold. Anyone who asks will question the theme, and I will merely state that you've always been a fan of Jackson Pollock." I'd never seen any of Jackson Pollock's work before in my life, but Theo showed me a few images on Google that meant I'd be okay to give the vague impression I actually knew a thing or two about art that didn't come from the few night classes I'd taken. On the eve of the garden safari, I helped Our Doris pick out her clothes. She'd chosen a Dorothy Perkins floral print dress and coral blue sandals with a light cream scarf. For me, she chose navy blue trousers and a white shirt. It's easier to dress a man, especially one whose wife keeps sending his clothes to Sue Ryder. Our Angela arrived early the next morning to help Our Doris get dressed, and I went to make sure the path was clean, swept leaves away from the drive, set up Elf on the drive to make sure all dog walkers cleaned up the mess. The first visitors arrived at about 11 o'clock. They'd already been to Peter Thompson's first house, a fate we were told was not as advertised, as he had headed off to Birmingham to visit his former sister-in-law, leaving nothing more than a note on his front door scrawled in wax crayon. Pandra O'Malley and her new boyfriend commented on the hanging baskets and how they were the perfect introduction to our garden, and that Mrs. Glover of the third house had hanging baskets, but they were filled with aphids and had thus been surrounded by black bin liners, making the garden more of a wake than a safari. Our Doris placed herself at the front door beside a table of refreshments and assembled the guests. She were ever the diplomat, asking after people's children and grandchildren, introducing them to our themed garden. Mrs. Sterling drew particular attention to Our Doris's salmon blinis, saying as they were the perfect texture and that light they practically melted on her tongue. Her husband looked a bit disgruntled, but that's to be expected from Arthur Sterling, a man whose father spent the majority of his final years upset he hadn't died fighting for his country. He got an infected case of impetigo that finally saw him off. Theo was the perfect gentleman. He wooed the grandmothers, paid particular attention to Opal Montague's dress. She's worn the same dress to all festive occasions since 1985, but no one says anything because her father was found in a ditch with Michael Preston. Everything was going fine until she appeared, like a spectre of death, Janice Dooley of Little Street. She wore a violet dress Our Doris wouldn't approve of that emphasised her varicose veins perfectly. It clung to each and every curve of her body, as though it had been made especially to show off her cellulite. I headed straight towards her, but it was Our Doris who intercepted her. Our Angela must have got a head start with wheeling her over. She sat with a cup of tea on her lap, which she handed to Janice. The entire party froze. I felt like we were in a western and a tumbleweed would be there any moment. Our Doris said to her, she said, "I am glad you have taken it upon yourself to join us on this day, Miss Dooley, in celebration of the people of Partridge Mews. Please do take a moment to enjoy the horticultural display my husband so lovingly created. Let us put our differences aside on today of all days." "Mrs. Copeland, I only came to see what all the fuss were about. After all, the majority of us here know that you've never lifted a finger in your life. And I don't know where it came from. I've never felt the need to defend my wife before. She's perfectly good at it herself. I said to Janice, I said, 'Why don't you just beg her off, Janice? You spent your life making a mockery of all of us. You're lucky Our Doris stopped beating you in graveyard, because if it had been me, I wouldn't have stopped until you returned to the primordial ooze you escaped from.'" The cup of tea were bundled back in Our Doris's hands as Janice said to me, she said, "I'm glad that you're able to have faith in your wife, Mr. Copeland, because so many people are unable to. I think it would be best if you shut your mouth and just left, because frankly not a single person here would care to hear what you have to say." And with that, Janice Dooley of Little Street left Shakespeare Avenue and the 5th house of the garden safari. Our Doris didn't say anything, but there were a definite glimmer of something in her eyes. As the day wore on and the food decreased and folk went home, me and Our Doris were left alone together. I sat in my deck chair next to her in a wheelchair and we stared out at the garden, inhaling the pollen, the falling sun warm against our faces, and Our Doris took one look at me and said to me, she said, "I think you should have an affair." Now I were the one giving her the look. I wondered if this were a sign of a stroke. I focused on her face. Her lips weren't drooping, no more than usual anyway. At 72 years old, you've got to expect some sagging. I must have been looking a bit funny because she whacked her arm against my stomach. "What's all that about, looking at me like I flipped my lid? I think you should have an affair." I said to her, I said, "Doris, we have been married for 54 years. Why do you want me to run into the arms of some other poor so-and-so?" That got her. I could tell because she stared up at the big tree in the garden, held her hands together and said nothing. Her eyes were all glazed over. She were thinking. If I've learnt anything these past few decades, it's not to interrupt her when she's thinking. Then she sighed and said, "I'd like to get my ironing done." I said to her, "You can iron. I'll take the inside right now and you can iron. I don't need to have an affair." She said, "You get under my feet." I said, "Oh." Usually, right about now, we'd be sat in the lounge watching Granada reports. I should have brought a thermos. A cup of sweet tea is what she needed. That'd stop her thinking about affairs. I'm 74. I don't have the sense to run off with a younger woman. Even with permission, I think Our Doris would kill me, and worse, she'd probably enjoy it. She looked at me and said, "I'd like a brew and a custard cream." I said, "Shall we go inside?" That got me the look. Well, where else will we bleeding go? Pontefract? I started to wheel her indoors, and I said to her, it must have been the feeling of the day. The sun was shining as it began its early evening descent, and I said, "I love you, you know, Our Doris." I saw something similar to a smile on her face, and she said to me, she said, "After 54 years, I should bleeding well think so." And she held my hand as a lone slug trailed its way towards the chrysanthemums.